Recording. All right. Hello, Professor. Let's get back up to top here and start. All right. I'm Klana Gilbard Johnson, and I did my final project on this wonderful elderly Black woman, a colleague in my family who has had this extraordinary life, and I will talk specifically about her youth in the 1960s in Washington, D.C. This is a bit personal for me as I live in Washington, D.C. currently, and that is Malcolm X Park in Northwest D.C., where I live. I live in, frankly, the whiter, considerably wealthier quadrant of the city. D.C. has changed astronomically in many, many ways. Where Tahita grew up is a few miles away from where I currently live. She grew up in the southwest quadrant of the city. This is a map from my public library, and you can see the city is divided into four quadrants. And again, just to give a little bit more historical era perspective, a little bit of macro perspective, Tahita, this is a public housing map, first of all, and where Tahita grew up would be where you see the river on the west side. She's near the Navy Yard. There are certainly jobs there. Many people were pulled into Washington, D.C. at the time because of government jobs. However, the south side of the city and the northeast quadrant, a lot of the city was called the murder capital for a reason. It was both an extraordinary place and very war torn, essentially, very torn by housing discrimination and segregation. I chose the Erikson life stage of initiative versus guilt, the third stage of a preschooler, for several reasons I will elucidate. The ages 3 to 6 in Tahita's life, preschool and kindergarten and first grade. Challenges. Tahita's life had lots of challenges, principally and foremost her father being murdered when she was 5 years old. So as I wrote about in my annotated bibliography with the Mayor Lee study on parental death, she, consulting my notes, so she started balancing a lot of jobs, right? In this concept of parental death during childhood, the guilt certainly comes in. Tahita talked about feeling this enormous sense of loss and like she got left behind, and immediately taking on these sort of compensatory roles, taking care a lot, much more than perhaps would be desirable in a young child, all these different jobs. I'll talk about that more later. And her favorite brother went into the army when he was 13 years old, shortly after her father was murdered. This, really just was devastating for her three older brothers, and it changed their lives in significant ways I will continue to discuss. And Tahita sort of took on some caretaking roles, both of these older brothers and of younger siblings, and her mother, just an extraordinary situation. So her favorite brother lied, went into the army. That was very hard on her to lose him in that way. And then another one of her older brothers went to jail. That's a harder part of this for her to talk about, so I did not push it. I do have, we'll talk about that a little bit more with imprisoned family members in the Tedros source here. But to go back up to the top, in terms of accomplishments in that third stage, that third Erikson stage, between 3, 4, 5, and 6 years old, Tahita was tap dancing and swimming. She was very active in all these kind of community provided areas. Not actually at church. She said that church was too sad for her mom, although Tahita started going later. That'll be important in a minute. And Tahita was keeping charge of money for her siblings as early as, as a 6-year-old, pretty extraordinary kind of financial acumen even then. And she is proud that she thrived enough in school then to eventually complete 2.5 years of college and to work productively, helping people for many decades in the legal aid field. So from my annotated bibliography, the Tedros source that has to do with educational attainment, people with imprisoned family members. It really just shakes everything to its core. And Black families, 1960s DC certainly, and often in general in America, are already disadvantaged by social programs that don't take their needs into account. So again, I also am impressed by the fact that Tahita thrived so much and looks at this past so gracefully and even went to college. Diversity and difference. So this was not a picnic of a time for a young Black girl in America, in Washington, D.C., famously. Race, class, gender, and social status were all disadvantaged areas for their family, not to mention their father being murdered. And Tahita's mother also had an infant at the time. But Tahita will tell you her mother owned a house. Her mother was a maid who worked very, very hard to be able to support them enough to move them into a house. You know, advantages of Washington, D.C. at the time, houses were not comparatively expensive. Real estate was a possibility for a lot of Black families, government jobs, and owning a home. And Tahita's mother did, in fact, own a home for them. And Tahita will say that she felt safe in the streets and on the buses, you know, with her siblings, even though her mother didn't want to let her out of the house very much after the murder. Spirituality in Black communities. So, in terms of diversity and difference, I have written about in my annotated bibliography the Hampton Anderson source on treating adverse childhood experiences in Black communities. I have abbreviated that as ACE here. There's a lot of evidence in this source that programs, community and social programs don't take into account enough that in Black communities, spirituality, the study talks especially about mothers and grandmothers. Tahita would become a mother, and so she very much kind of fits into this general category. The spirituality in Black communities then, and continuing that adverse childhood experiences are often greatly mitigated by that kind of spirituality, again, especially with women. That's a very important factor in shaping effective social programs that is often neglected by white people. Not a surprise. Oppression. So again, we would never have enough minutes to talk about this, but it was the 1960s. Her father, I believe, was murdered in 1962. So we all know 1954 did not undo segregation, right? Brown v. Board of Education had a great impact on school segregation eventually. Not always immediately, of course. Progress does not happen flipping a light switch. In the 1960s, you know, when her father was murdered, school segregation was still quite the issue, of course. And you know, 1968 was coming on the heels of 1962. Dr. King would be murdered. Famous race riots in Washington, D.C. Just extraordinary and completely unacceptable violence against Black communities. Housing segregation was very bad in DC. It's frankly still not great with gentrification, but it has changed to some extent. So Tahita's mother did own a home in the Southwest sector. There were plenty of other challenges related to housing, but they had a home. Unemployment was at least 30% for people of color there. The term was non-whites in the study, but I have said people of color, trying to be careful about offensive terms, frankly, wading into that. Unemployment nationally at the time was something like 4%, but in DC, you know, a third of the non-white population was unemployed, at least. Okay, biopsychosocial lens versus a micro, meso, macro lens. How did Tahita's personality, environment, and historical era help or hinder her aspirations or opportunities? That's our central question here, really. In a biopsychosocial lens, right, biologically, Tahita was tap dancing, she was walking and taking the bus and, you know, pretty healthy. Her family managed to be pretty healthy, although incarceration and murder, not biological advantages for a family. Psychologically, she talked a lot about how her mother, you know, they didn't believe in counseling. Her mother kind of wanted to sweep it all under the rug and not talk about feelings. You know, we know generally in society that the American Black woman feels like she has to be a superwoman all the time, lots of articles about that I didn't use for this presentation, to be clear. Socially, she did have friends and siblings. She did have community around her. She started going to church. Her mother said church was too sad. Interestingly, her third brother started a radio station that continues to be of some repute in DC. So Tahita said that there was a certain fame that she was not necessarily comfortable with. She enjoyed the fame from the radio station, but there was this kind of focus on their family because of the murder. The brothers the brother goes off to the army, brother goes off to prison, and Tahita talked about a boarding school for another one of her brothers. They were away or back, or they were getting talked about a lot. A humanistic perspective within the biopsychosocial lens that would center on Tahita herself as an active agent with the potential for creative growth, for cognitive growth, and that's from the Rogers source specifically, that phrase. Tahita was a resourceful and purposeful little girl who was protecting her family, who was was involved in school to some extent, kind of had to replace some parental guidance with school. And she was protecting her family and recovering from that, finding initiative and trying to handle the guilt also of that stage, that crisis of identity crisis, famously from Erikson. Okay, in a micro, meso, macro lens, it's a stock photo from PowerPoint. So in the micro level, in terms of, Tahita herself and her personality, she said she talked to God a lot at the time. She was recovering from that loss. She felt left behind. She said that she had to just sort of learn how to get past that, and God and spirituality is how that happened for her. In a meso lens, so we talk about, family and church and those kind of surrounding communities. She did have some protection there. And then in a macro lens, again, not a picnic in 1962 for a young Black girl. Black people were protecting their own communities as best they could, while rioting is almost, I think, a racist term. Black people were not doing anything wrong, but there was certainly enormous unrest from crazy white people. Attachment theory in this case could be quite relevant as another theory to apply. Tahita's mother became very attached to her when her father was murdered. When Tahita's father was murdered, really just did not, she was able to leave with her siblings and go to the movies and, go to the swimming pool and everything, but her mother really was resistant to that, did not want to let her out of the house, understandably didn't want to lose her daughter. And later didn't even want to let her go to college, although Tahita did accomplish that on her own. And then Tahita in turn became less attached to her mother, was resistant to that kind of iron control. Limitations of attachment theory. Frankly, personally, I believe that attachment theory has many limitations in general. In this case, we are talking about a Black woman and a Black family. Well, attachment theory, first of all, attachment theory research, including in our Rogers text, focuses very much on infants. In our textbook, only on infants. And in sort of pop culture, there's a lot of attachment theory on adults in romantic relationships. Well, Mary Ainsworth was racist. She borrowed Ugandan infants and traumatized them and gave them back. To what extent is this applicable in Tahita's case? Can we be sure that modern attachment theory considers diverse perspectives? On a personal note, I found a lot of sort of progress in myself in doing this project with Tahita. I really enjoyed talking to her. I would not disrespect her by making conclusions about her life, but I have conclusions about mine. To skip back for a second, really just a painful and lovely childhood. She's so graceful about it. The oppressive social and federal systems to which Tahita and her family, typo there, were subjected is unacceptable and horrifying. The grace with which she speaks of her upbringing now is inspiring. I hope that in my own life, I am a street medic for Black Lives Matter protests here in DC, and I hope to honor her with the social justice work that I do and that I plan to do. Thank you very much, Professor.